Thank you, Steve. We're at Revelation chapter 14, and before we get there this morning, I want to talk about harvest, because harvest is the imagery that's used in this last part of Revelation 14 to talk about what God has in mind for the future. Revelation 14 serves as a table of contents to the remaining chapters of the book, giving us an outline of what takes place in the latter half of the Great Tribulation. We start with the perseverance of the 144,000 Jewish evangelists that we were introduced to in chapter 7. And then the fall of political and economic Babylon, which is a symbol for the world system of evil. We'll see more about that in chapters 17 and 18. And then the War of Armageddon, which is the subject of the harvest that John describes in chapter 14, verses 14 to 20. We'll have much more details about Armageddon in chapters 16 and 19, but before these last 7 judgments, the vial judgments or bowl judgments are poured out, John is taking sort of a time out to focus on some things a little bit closer up in chapters 14 and 15. So we made it through about half of chapter 14 last Sunday, and so we're going to try to finish that chapter in the time that I have. But first I want to talk about the harvest imagery that he's going to be using here. And this is a very prominent theme in both the Old and New Testaments. And you would expect that because the Bible was written in an agrarian or agriculture-based society of the ancient world. Jesus employs that harvest imagery in several of his parables that are recorded in the Gospels. I did a little digging, and one of my favorite resources that somehow I managed to get a hold of is called the Dictionary of Biblical Imagery, and being a sort of an English major writer type, I really enjoy books and stuff that talk about how the Bible is the literary structure of the Bible and things. So I came across this giant, it's thick book, but it really, and I knew that in it would be something about harvest, and I was not disappointed. And so I wanted to share with you at length what that resource says about the harvest imagery. And with that in mind, then we'll hopefully understand Revelation 14 a little bit better. So this quotation, lengthy quotation I'm going to read, starts out as at a physical level, harvest is perhaps the preeminent image in Scripture of abundance and its accompanying emotions. Its failure is the ultimate terror for a farming society. Among what harvest represents is the fulfillment of creation's purpose, which is to be fruitful, an occasion to capitalize for God's glory, including the evangelization of a lost world. Jesus said, look at the harvest, and we need workers for the harvest. The fields are white unto harvest. Also, God's blessing on those who follow him and judgment against the disobedient. We'll see that specifically in chapter 14 of Revelation. An occasion that simultaneously rewards a person for labor and tests a person's moral and spiritual status. The consummation of a process that must be worked out over time, like the full program of God's kingdom, and that certainly is a theme in the book of Revelation. Salvation history is itself like a slow movement toward a climactic harvest. God tends his growing crop as it moves toward a final harvest. In both testaments, particular actions associated with the time of harvest are images of divine judgment against evil. But it's important to note that the image of harvest itself is seldom a negative image of judgment. I think that's something to keep in mind, that it has much more of a positive connotation. But the picture in Revelation 14 includes both. First, a positive image of the wheat harvest, of the redeemed, and I'll go into that in a few minutes, and which is the harvest signaled by the first fruits of the redeemed, and that's the 144,000 described as first fruits for the rest of the harvest in verses 1 to 5 of Revelation. But this is followed immediately by the vintage harvest, which is an image of judgment. So there's some background there. Now, you do all this background stuff, and, yeah, Mark, you like to study a lot, so you're an academic, and I'm about ready. I see eyes glazing over, or sort of right now. Maybe it's my own eyes that I'm seeing glazed over, I don't know. So I'm going to put it forward to you pretty early about an application to all this stuff, and it's in the principle of sowing and reaping. So you're not going to get out of town without the application being right up front before you do have your eyes glaze over. But here's the principle I want you to see from Galatians chapter 6, verses 7 to 10 that Steve read for us, that what is reaped corresponds necessarily to what is sown. Does that make sense? So if you reap wheat, what are you going to get? Apples? Well, you can hope for that, but it's probably not going to happen. If you reap, well, you get the point. So this provides a motive for right conduct, and that's what the Apostle Paul is urging us on to in Galatians 6. He says, man reaps what he sows. The one who sows to please his flesh, or the sinful nature, from that nature will reap destruction. Corresponding, you reap to the sinful nature, and what the fruit of the sinful nature is death and destruction. So if you reap to the flesh, don't be surprised. You're not going to get a good result at harvest time. The one who sows to please the Spirit, from the Spirit will reap eternal life. Then he gives an example of some of this sowing. A seed that could be sown is doing good. Doing good. And then he uses the harvest theme. For at the proper time, he says, let's not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. So in the book of Revelation, the seed sown is sin, and the harvest reaped is God's judgment. And we'll see how this unfolds as we turn there. But first, a verse from Job, the book of Job, chapter 4, verse 8, where one of Job's wonderful friends, Eliphaz, observed, and he's not wrong with this, it's just how, we know truth, but how we apply the truth, especially in other people's lives, is where we get all messed up. And this is Eliphaz. He knows this truth in the book of Job. He says, those who plow iniquity or evil and those who sow trouble harvest it. That's the truth. Unfortunately, he used it against Job, who didn't do either one. And so, but that's the whole story of the book of Job. So, but the principle is right. if you sow or plow evil or sin or iniquity, then you're going to reap trouble. You'll reap the same thing. And that's what's coming across here in chapter 14 of the book of Revelation. So if you want to track with me, turn there. And I'm going to start reading at verse 14. I looked, John writes, and there before me was a white cloud, and seated on the cloud was one like a son of man, with the crown of gold on his head. That's the victor's crown, the Stephanos, not the diadem, on his head, and a sharp sickle in his hand. And then another angel came out of the temple and called in a loud voice to him who was sitting on the cloud. You don't think the angels and the Lord don't have conversations. This gets some enlightenment here. Take your sickle and reap, because the time to reap has come, for the harvest of the earth is ripe. So he who was seated on the cloud swung his sickle over the earth, and the earth was harvested. I believe that's one segment of the harvest. Then there's a second segment at verse 17. Another angel came out of the temple in heaven, and he too had a sharp sickle. Still another angel, man, these angels all over the place here, who had charge of the fire, came from the altar. That could be either the altar of incense or even the brazen altar of sacrifice, and called in a loud voice to him who had the sharp sickle, take your sharp sickle and gather the clusters of grapes from the earth's vine, because its grapes are ripe. The angel swung his sickle on the earth, gathered its grapes, and threw them into the great winepress of God's wrath. They were trampled in the winepress outside the city, a reference to Jerusalem, and blood flowed out of the press, rising as high as the horses' bridles, for a distance of 180 to 200 miles, is what 1,600 stadia corresponds to. That's the harvest of the earth. So we're getting heaven's view of the climax of God's judgment, which the vials or the bowl judgments will detail as we get to chapters 15 and 16. Interesting to note that both aspects of the harvest originate from the heavenly temple, which is the symbol of God's presence. So we start with the harvest of wheat, and I'm thinking that there's a difference between the harvest of wheat, which it appears that the one sitting on the cloud, one like a son of man, is a reference to Jesus Christ. And so he handles the harvest of wheat himself, where one of the angels handles the vintage harvest that finishes out the chapter. I'm thinking that the harvest of wheat is the ingathering of the righteous out of the tribulation period. And the vintage harvest, the harvest of grapes, is the unsaved or the unrighteous or the wicked, which it's interesting that if I'm right, which of course I am, but if I'm right, the Lord handles his own people himself personally. And I think that's a message of comfort there. He doesn't let an angel deal with the righteous. He does it himself. And he's on a white cloud, and the white cloud is a symbol of purity and righteousness of the judge and the judgment he pronounces. And some would go so far as to say that the Shekinah glory, which is predominant in the Old Testament, is what's in view here. The cloud is associated with Jesus and his second coming quite often. Matthew 24, at that time the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and all the nations of the earth will mourn. Why will they mourn? Because they have sowed the wrong thing. And when they're confronted with it, it causes sadness rather than joy for those who are about to be punished. They will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory. And he will send his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of the heavens to the other. In other words, the harvest of wheat in the Revelation 14 picture. Back in chapter 1, verse 7 of Revelation, look, he is coming with the clouds, and every eye will see him, even those who pierced him, and all of the peoples of the earth will mourn because of him. And that's an idea that's brought forward in Daniel 7 and also Zechariah chapter 12, verse 10. Sharp sickle. Jesus has a sharp sickle in his hand in verse 14. The other angel that's going to take care of the grapes it has a sharp sickle in verse 17. Sharp sickle means a thorough harvest. Nothing's going to be left behind. It will be a complete job. This isn't a dull sickle that takes care of one set of stalks but leaves others behind. This one's going to get them all, in both the wheat and the vines, or the grapes. And so I think he's separating the wheat, which is the believers of the time. Now remember, we as the church, we're already out of the picture. We're in heaven, probably observing this from a heavenly vantage point. So we're talking about the righteous of the tribulation period in Revelation 14. So we're going to have to separate the wheat from the tares, or the unbelieving wicked. And it made me think just this morning, and I didn't know where the reference was, so I enlisted assistance, and I got it. And the reference that came to my mind was this picture that Jesus talks about in the Olivet Discourse, which is his lengthy statement about his second coming. And it says in Matthew 24, verse 40 and 41, 2 men will be in the field, one will be taken, the other left. 2 women will be grinding with the handmill, one will be taken and the other left. And then my mind thought, Larry Norman. And those of us who are old enough, to know what I just talking about, he wrote this song called I Wish We'd All Been Ready. And this was, one of the anthems of the Jesus people in the late 60s and early 70s. And we all got our theology from that song. And we all thought that the meaning of Matthew 24, verses 40 and 41 is the rapture. And the one that's taken is being raptured. Well, I'm going to disappoint some of you, but I'm here to tell you that the ones who are taken in Matthew 24, verses 40 and 41, are taken for judgment, not for the rapture. And this comes at the end of the tribulation, and the one who is left, that's the righteous one, left to begin the millennium. So you have to be careful. You've got to get your theology not from Larry Norman, not even from Bill Gaither, almost, but he's almost as close to being right on every song he's written, right, Marcia? you know, because Marcia likes Bill Gaither a lot. You know, not even from Phil Wickham, or who's the other guy that we sing a lot of his songs? Chris Tomlin. You know, you've got to get your theology from your pastor. It's just pure and simple. I didn't hear any amens, hallelujahs, or anything to that. I don't know. I don't know where I stand now. But what is the point I'm trying to make? There's a separation there in verses 40 and 41 of Matthew 24, and I think it parallels the separation of the righteous, the wheat, from the tares, or in Revelation 14, the grapes, which is a picture of the unrighteous at the end of the tribulation. And that's how I think, because Matthew 24 is not talking about what goes on in or about the church. It's the last times when the Jewish nation will be back in the forefront during the last 7 years after the rapture. So this is an Old Testament theme also. Joel chapter 3. Swing the sickle, for the harvest is ripe. Come, trample the grapes. Interesting, both of them, both images in the same prophetic statement in Joel. For the winepress is full and the vats overflow. So great is their wickedness. Multitudes, multitudes in the valley of decision. For the day of the Lord is near in the valley of decision. And that valley of decision is the plain of Megiddo, that we commonly call Armageddon. When the angel said that the harvest is ripe, in verse 15, take your sickle and reap, because the time to reap has come, for the harvest of the earth is ripe. What he's meaning here is the Greek word could be better translated overripe, or about to wither or dry up or to rot. In other words, had not God's grace and mercy intervened, the harvesting could have begun long ago. The time of judgment is overdue, in a sense. And don't you have that feeling in your heart that why are all these things going on? These evil people that are out there orchestrating our politics and our culture and our economy, just you name it. Evil people in the guise of being Christians and in the church that are leading people astray. How does God put up with that? Why does he put up with that? Don't you ask these questions? I do. And I think that the message here in verse 15 is similar to that the harvest is ripe. It's overripe. It should have been collected a long time ago. Jesus explains this in his parable of the weeds in Matthew 13, and this was one where he told the story, and then he explained what it meant. So I'm going to focus on the meaning of it. He says, the harvest is the end of the age, and the harvesters are angels. And then he says, the Son of Man will send out his angels, and they will weed out of his kingdom everything that causes sin and all who do evil. They will throw them into the fiery furnace, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. He who has ears, let him hear. Anytime Jesus says that, or John in the book of Revelation, we need to pay attention. This is another reason why I think the Matthew 24, 40, and 41 reference is talking about end of the tribulation, one taken for judgment off the earth, the other left on the earth to go into Christ's 1,000-year reign. Here's the angels weeding out of his kingdom everything that causes sin and all who do evil. And after they're gone, then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. I can hardly wait for that. And I'm sure you have the same sense. At verse 17, he talks about the harvest of grapes, or the vintage harvest. And this is gathering the unsaved for judgment. Here, the harvest is fully ripe again. Not just ripe in the end of verse 18, but the original language says fully ripe. It's as if God says, enough. I've had it. You finally stretched my patience to the ultimate. I'm not going to be patient any longer. There's no more mercy left. I offered it, you refused it. So these grapes are almost bursting with the juice of evil. They're going to be collected, gathered, and then sent into the great winepress of God's wrath. Now, winepress is also an interesting term, just like harvest. Winepress, in and of itself, was a positive term. You collected the grapes off the vine, you put them in their winepress, which were pits, either dug out of rock or lined with plaster, and you threw them into the grapes into there, and then you took off your sandals and you got your feet into the. Anybody ever done that? Like a vat, I haven't either. When I see it done, people stomping on. I think there was a I Love Lucy episode where where Lucy and Ethel get in there and all those grapes are mushing in between their toes and everything. Oh. Yeah. Oh, do they pick up the grapes and throw them at each other by the end of the show? Wow. I only tell you this stuff so that it should elicit a feeling in you. So anyway, and the reason you stomp on these grapes is to get the juice out. So God is going to stomp on the grapes of the wicked, and blood, and I believe literal blood, will flow. And the winepress is a preview of Armageddon. And notice what happens here in verse 20. They were trampled in the winepress outside Jerusalem. That's where the Armageddon, which is to the north. The plain of Megiddo is to the north in Israel. But then there's another valley that's somewhat adjacent called the Valley of Jehoshaphat, and that's just outside Jerusalem. And in the Old Testament prophets, both of those valleys are going to be involved in this final war and final battle. We usually call it the Battle of Armageddon, but the Battle of Armageddon is actually the last event in the war of Armageddon, which stretches out for at least 3.5 years, if not longer, in that tribulation period. Blood up to the horses' bridles. Is that literal? Or is it figurative? The 180 to 200 mile distance is, believe it or not, that's almost exactly the distance from north to south in Palestine. So the entire Holy Land is going to be enveloped in this final war. Whether it's literal or figurative, it's horrible. It's horrible. If this is literal, it's horrible. If it's figurative, then what's the picture that John is trying to paint? How bad it's going to be. That the blood is going to be up to the horse's bridle.